Hello, and this is lecture 4. This will be the last lecture that I have that is based on a short story or a text in the reading pack. The next lecture I will give will be on the essay questions, and I'll be discussing each one in a few more, in a few minutes, say 10 minutes for each essay question, so look out for that one. So this will be the last lecture that'll have a specific reading attached to it. And in this case, it is Masande Nchanga's Space, which was published about 10 years ago or so, around there. I think around 2010, 2011, and was nominated for all sort of prestigious prizes, won a few prizes as well. It is quite a good story, and I quite like it. And this is the person that we're talking about today, the author whose work we'll be studying, Masande Nchanga. He was born, I think, in the Eastern Cape somewhere, which is where the story takes place. Well, the story takes place in Ciskei before there was an Eastern Cape. And I'm a bit sketchy on the details, but I think he was a graduate of the UCT creative writing course in around 2010, 2011, around there. And he's been a sort of known, successful author since then. These are his two novels. He's published a whole lot of short stories, and these two novels as well. The first one that you see on the left is called The Reactive. You can't really see this very clearly because I have a low quality image for The Reactive, but there's a shout out from another author, another South African author called Imran Kuvadia, on The Reactive, on the cover of The Reactive. Imran Kuvadia served as Masande Nchanga's supervisor when he was doing his master's in creative writing at UCT. Kuvadia is also quite a well-known and respected South African author. He's written quite a few books that I quite like. I haven't read The Reactive, but it's also been nominated for all sorts of prestigious awards and has been sort of critically respected as well. I have read Triangulum, which is, it's okay. This is Nchanga's exploration into Afrofuturism, his most explicit exploration into Afrofuturism. And I'll speak about how the short story that we'll be discussing today, Space, sort of has Afrofuturist leanings, but is not entirely Afrofuturist. But Triangulum, this massive, I think, 500-page novel, which I must say I plodded through a little bit, is quite explicitly Afrofuturist. It takes place in South Africa. I don't think quite in our time, but sort of a few decades from where we are, and follows sort of teenagers as they transition into adulthood. And there are science fiction elements as well. And as far as I can recall, I think also some supernatural elements too. But yeah, my memory is fuzzy on it. He is quite. I've seen him at book launches, at the book launch of Triangulum. He's quite sort of a calm, soft-spoken man, very sort of contemplative, very thoughtful, and sort of measures his speech, speaks very articulately, and you can certainly see that in his writing. He's a very confident writer. And I think that comes through in his short story as well, but I certainly could detect that in Triangulum there was a sophistication of style that was evident in Triangulum that was absent in Space. But I think where Space doesn't have as much a sophisticated style as, say, Triangulum, doesn't have as much as a confident or sophisticated voice, it does certainly make up for it in content. It's a very complex short story, and it's quite layered, and there are quite a few very difficult and contrasting but also complementary themes at play within the short story, but it also coheres into one thing. The reactive, again, which I said I haven't read, but what I know of it, what I've read about it, is that it takes place within sort of post 94 South Africa, sort of contemporary-ish South Africa. Takes place within Cape Town, and also focuses on young black South Africans living in Cape Town at that specific time, where what the author tries to do is try to encapsulate the feeling of sort of pointlessness, the feeling of nihilism, I suppose, that comes with being a black South African within post-apartheid South Africa, where the promises of 1994 haven't been realized as fully as to the satisfaction of a certain generation of South Africans. And so he seems to focus mainly on this time in all these three works, the reactive, triangulum, and space. He seems to be interested in a specific time in South Africa, which is the time around 1994, either right before it, as in space, right after it in these novels. And so this is sort of the time that he is developing an argument about, developing thoughts about as he writes his stories. As I said, space is not explicitly Afrofuturist, but this won't really be my central endeavor into this text, but it is one. It is an interesting question to ask, specifically because I've included it in this course called Afrofuturism. So there aren't any spaceships, there aren't any ray guns, there aren't any supernatural worlds, there aren't really gods that people speak to, there aren't strange diseases at play, but there is a language of science fiction that is evident throughout the text. The title itself suggests that. And the way the characters interact with the world suggests that too. They interpret the world through science fiction and science fiction language. And their understanding of the world is based on that kind of language, and it informs how they interpret the world. So while it isn't about space aliens or about time travel or anything specifically science fiction, it does make use of that language to explore what blackness means at a certain time in South Africa's history, and using language of science fiction to explore black identity is sort of the basis of Afrofuturism. Using the language of science fiction to determine the different ways that we could be black in the world, definitions of blackness, how it could mean this or that, how it couldn't mean that or this, etc. So what this text is that it is sort of Afrofuturist, but not sincerely so, not as explicitly so as the other texts that we've discussed already. To look at the title, there are various kinds of spaces that are alluded to in the title and within the short story. And everything about the story seems to tether itself to this idea of space, and how we occupy space, and what kind of spaces we occupy that are politicized, the kind of power structures that are evident within certain spaces. The first kind of space that we are made aware of is the town that it is set in, the town the story is set in, which is Bishu. And at the time in which the story is set is 1992, and this year in Bishu is particularly important because in September of that year, there was the Bishu massacre that took place in September 1992. It's a detail of South African history that is often either forgotten or just not known. And I think Nchanga treats the incident in the same kind of way. He doesn't look at the event itself, the Bishu massacre itself, but it is alluded to. It's sort of on the margins or the periphery of the story. I think the story also takes place before the massacre. So when you read about the soldiers that are in and around town, um, what Nchanga is trying to do, I think, is just to hint to the reader that this is a significant moment in Bishu's history, and also the country's history overall, but he's not going to explicitly show it to you. And also, the story takes place before the massacre. So it's something that sort of the reader, if the reader knows about this history, is anticipating, because this is what Bishu was infamous for in that year, 1992. And the other kind of space that the title alludes to is, of course, outer space, the kind of space that you read about in science fiction stories, about space travel, about rocket ships, about aliens. This is the kind of space that the title suggests as well, in addition to all the other kinds of spaces. So we have Bishu before, which is a very concrete kind of space, a space that has a name, a space that has a certain cultural, historical, political identity, and the history, and a specific kind of history as well. So what happened in Bishu in 1992 is that it was within the Siskai, and at that time there was essentially a military dictatorship that was happening, and the ANC tried to intervene and stop this military dictatorship, and the dictatorship retaliated as the ANC was protesting in September, I think September the 7th, I think, and 28 people died. So that is a real concrete historical thing that happened. That is something that is tangible, that is something that has been written about, as opposed to this other kind of space, this outer space, which is defined by its lack. So this is the space that doesn't mean anything. This is a space that is anticipating some kind of meaning to be assigned to it. And it is also the space that suggests the story's science fiction elements. So, as I said before, the story, or the children in the story, these four boys, the protagonist who is nameless, rely on the language of science fiction to understand the world around them. And what they try to understand, as we'll get into later, is masculinity, and also disease. The third kind of space, the other kinds of concrete spaces that are suggested within the title, and made mention of within the text, the shopping malls, the local, which is what they call the school, the spaza shop, Matano spaza shop, and also Parliament. So these are the spaces that the boys try to occupy. We also see them trying to go to the Amatola Sun, and in their attempt to do so, they witness a white woman sort of sunbathing or something, and the discussion around that is, or the suggestion and the implication around that conversation when they reach the Amatola Sun, is that they're not allowed in that space, but the white woman is. So spaces aren't just these abstract things, not all the time within the story. One suggestion of the space alluded to is outer space, that nothingness, but then there are also these kind of spaces like Bishu that are heavily politicized, that have histories, that have power structures evident within them. So the boys can't go to the shopping mall because they are black, not only because they are young, but also because they are black and therefore excluded from it. But the white woman is allowed to go there. So she has more power in this space than they do. So different kinds of spaces mean different kinds of things to different kinds of people, depending on which category they belong to. And these categories in this case are whether or not you are black. And this is sort of the other big theme within the text, which is sexuality and how we've defined it in the early 90s in South Africa. So broadly, um, sexuality under apartheid meant something very different to how we understand sexuality in South Africa now. Um, of course, there were all the laws determining what kind of sex you could have with whom. Um, Laws against sex between people of the same sex, so women couldn't have sex with women, or laws against having sex with someone of a different kind of race to you, whatever race, however the apartheid government defined race at the time. So people of European descent could have sex with people of European descent, and only under marriage, and people who were black could only have sex with people who were black. So intimacy, intimacy between people was defined along racial lines in apartheid South Africa, and we sort of still see the echoes of that very strongly today in prison South Africa. But I don't think Nchanga's necessarily interested in those kinds of questions about sexuality. What I think he's mainly interested in is are the questions around sexuality that that was influenced by AIDS and the AIDS pandemic, which is still an ongoing thing. So, in the early 90s, intimacy meant something completely different to what it does now. In the early 90s, when this new strange disease called HIV first reached South Africa, it was something that we didn't know how to define. It was something that we didn't know what to do with. I specifically remember in primary school, when I went to primary school in the early 90s, that we would get talks by sort of sex education people, and they would come to our schools and talk to us about sex and what kind of sex is safe sex, always use a condom, was sort of the mantra of the 90s. And what I think this did to intimacy, and this is really just my perspective here, what I think this did to intimacy is that it made us afraid to become intimate with each other. We were scared to touch each other because we didn't really understand how one could contract HIV. So we're scared of being close to people and people we didn't know, and people we couldn't trust. So something was sort of broken between us. That sort of intimate link was sort of broken between us because of HIV and the new dangers it brought with it. So the text, I think, is primarily interested in this, first of all, and then more specifically interested in what that does to masculinity. So in this story, weirdly, we have these boys stealing panties. As boys do, I guess. I'm not quite sure. But this is certainly what they do. They go around the town stealing panties of washing lines. And they sort of characterize and define this in a very specific way where there's a kind of bravado and there's a kind of bravado that is attached to the theft of panties of washing lines. You are complimented because of it. You are made group leader because of it. You are looked up to by the other boys because of it. So not only is it interesting that they're stealing panties to define their masculinity, but it is the theft itself that is interesting. It's the theft itself that around which their masculinity is defined. And we see this as well in the kinds of objects they steal from the malls that they frequent. So on page 178, we have this, the nameless narrator telling us this. At OK, during our short career there, I managed to nab a Bruce Lee poster and a Spider-Man figurine. CK scored himself 2 twin silver revolver BB guns. Then, one cold Saturday in the middle of April, one guy who wasn't in our gang, this chubby lighter who didn't go to school with us down at the local, got caught and carried wailing into a dark room at the back of the supermarket. I don't need to tell you which idiot's parents were there. CK and I dropped everything we'd stuffed on ourselves and walked out slowly. We'd heard about the bored security guards who waited in the back room with the batons and shell-toe boots. they'd been put on Earth to sort out precisely guys like us. So this is a longish quote, and there are a few longish quotes in here, which I find actually quite nice because it shows the sort of the density of what Nchanga is trying to say about these boys at this time in South Africa. And so at the beginning of the quote, we have, "At OK, during our short career there, I managed to nab a Bruce Lee poster and a Spider-Man figurine." What is interesting about this is the kinds of things that they steal, the kinds of things that draw them. So Bruce Lee and Spider-Man, these are men of a very particular kind. They are men who, for good or bad, use violence to solve problems. Whether it is to save someone or not, there's this use of violence to act within the world, and it is seen as admirable what they do. And what is also interesting about them is that they are not real. They are figures who are not at all part of this world that we know. Bruce Lee belongs to this world of martial arts, which is very artistic and has sort of a flourish to it, very cinematic, gets himself into these impossible situations, beats up 100 men at the time in one go. Spider-Man has these sort of weird science fiction-y superpowers that allow him to act like a spider and swing from building to building, and has this weird sort of strength to him as well. So these are figures not of our world, and this is sort of where the science fiction Afrofuturist element comes in. I said earlier that the boys use science fiction and language of science fiction to understand the world around them. We'll see that more explicitly in how they confront and define the alien man, the grey man. But this is one indication of that as well. So Spider-Man is a better example than Bruce Lee. Spider-Man is a sort of science fiction character, has this weird reaction, chemical reaction that happens, and he becomes this man who has this spider-like abilities. So he's an example of what the boys seem to admire in the world. We'll get to why they do this later on in the lecture, but for now it's enough to know that this is how they define the world through science fiction, through the language of science fiction, through the kinds of stories that science fiction tells us, and they sort of model their behavior on these kinds of figures. The last part of the quote there, and the last 2 or 3 sentences, we'd heard about the bold security guards who waited in the back room with the batons and shell-toe boots. They'd been put on the earth to sort out precisely guys like us. Again, we can assume the security guards are these sort of uber-masculine figures. They are there to defend people. They are there to protect people. They wear a uniform. They're probably quite strong and muscular. And what these boys do is that they classify these security guards in terms of science fiction. In other words, they see them as aliens, beings who are not particularly of this earth, this planet, this world, but somewhere outside of this world. They've been put on Earth to sort out precisely guys like us. So they come from somewhere other than Earth. So the security guards, like Spider-Man, are understood through the language of science fiction. They don't recognize that men like this, like the security guards, can exist in the world, only because they haven't really encountered people like this before. And this is why they haven't encountered men like this before. So this is the last page of the story, and it's a long extract, but there is much to discuss within it. So this is the culmination of all the events in the story. At the beginning of the story, the boys set out on a journey. They go on this adventure. The story is styled as an adventure where these boys have this quest that they need to go on. They have this goal that they must fulfill. And the goal, in a sentence, is find the grey man. Look at the grey man. And finally, at the end of the story, they do encounter the grey man, which they call the grey man an alien. So this is the extract. The man inside the shed isn't an alien, but he has CK's teeth and the body of an 11-year-old girl. His head sits massive on his small neck, the skin on his face drawn so tight against the bone it looks like it was sprayed on his skull. Tobela covers his nose the same time as I do. It smells like the inside of a latrine. This is my father, CK says. He kneels down next to the man. He's like an alien, isn't he? Tobela and I say nothing. CK waves for us to go closer and we inch forward. What's wrong with him? Tobela asks. Matano says he got it working in Joburg. No one really knows what it is. CK dribbles a small amount of beer into his palm and pours into the man's mouth. As he gets up, we hear the kitchen door slamming open. Tobela and I throw glances at each other in panic, but CK just stands there. When I reach for him, he doesn't move. So Tobela and I run out of the shed without him. We scale the wall just as Matano bursts screaming out of the kitchen. On the tar, my feet no longer feel the heat. And as we run down Mia Street, Tobela and I, the cloud moves away from the sun and the world seems to change, growing bright and intense like a beam from an alien ship. So, as you've noticed, there is a lot going on here. What we first notice at the beginning of the extract is that the encounter that CK has, he and his friends have with this man, clarifies a lot about the mystery that surrounds him. At the beginning of the story, we only have this child's perspective, only have information coming through the child's perspective. But at the end of the story here, we see how that information was misunderstood simply because he was a child. This is a new disease in South Africa. The early 90s, AIDS was something that was unknown widely at least. People, particularly in small communities, were unsure about what this was, what to call it, as illustrated by this story, where the boys just simply don't know what it is. Even Matano, it's suggested, the adult here, doesn't really understand what's happening. So CK admits that this man is his father, but what is interesting here is that the story that his father, that comes with his father's story. So his father, Matano says, got this disease, which is very heavily suggested to be HIV, working in Joburg. So this is almost a cliche of a story that black men in townships outside of Johannesburg would go to Johannesburg, work in the mines there, and then there would be prostitutes around the residences of the miners, and these prostitutes, because of the nature of their work, would contract and spread HIV, and the men working in the mines, sleeping with the prostitutes, would also then contract the disease. So this is a very common story in South Africa, and what Nchanga tries to do here, I think, is give a child's perspective on this. And through the child's perspective, we realize that it stands as a metaphor for the mystery behind HIV during this time. So the child, much like the country at the time, was unsure about what to call this thing. And he comes back to Joburg, his father comes back to Joburg, and we realize that he has changed, or the boys realize that he has changed, and there's sort of a few things going on here. CK, and we'll get to the other children as well, but CK seems to define this this person as an alien because he doesn't know what men can look like. So, because his father was absent from his life, because his father had been working in a mine trying to support his family elsewhere outside of his town Bishu, um, CK didn't have much interaction with his father, it suggested. So when his father comes back, he doesn't know how to define what this thing is, and simply calls it an alien, a grey man, an alien. And this overall is, I think, what happens to the boys, and we'll see different examples of this in each of the boys as well, where a certain kind of definition of masculinity is predicated on an absent father of some kind. In CK's case, his father worked as a miner, and that explains his absence from their lives. So CK, we can sort of understand his situation sympathetically. He must be, I don't know, about 9 or 10 or so. I think their ages are given at the beginning of the story. So he's around that age. He's sort of entering puberty. He's beginning to understand what the world means around him, but doesn't have enough support, or at least he doesn't recognize that he has enough support within his life to understand how things work yet. So he resorts to the things that he knows and has access to. And the kinds of things he has access to, like the other boys, are things like Bruce Lee and Spider-Man, and the panties that they snatch off washing lines. So they rely on pop culture in order to define their masculinity in the absence of their fathers. At the end of the extract, we have this section here. On the tar, my feet no longer feel the heat, and as we run down Mia Street to Bella and I, the cloud moves away from the sun, and the world seems to change, growing bright and intense like a beam from an alien ship. I realize I'm hopping around here in the story. I've gone to the end, but there's still lots of things I want to discuss within the story itself. But thematically, I think there's sort of a build-up of explanation here. At the end of the story here, the protagonist, the nameless protagonist, encounters this alien, and at the start of this extract, he immediately recognizes this is not an alien. The man inside the shed isn't an alien. But he tries to figure out what kind of person this is, simply because he has never seen a person like this before. He's never seen a person, particularly a man, who is weak, who is frail, who is sickly. He doesn't understand really that this can also be a kind of man. This is also a way of being a man in the world. Even if you are sick and frail, this is still, men can still be sick and frail. They don't always have to be Spider-Man or Bruce Lee or look like the security guards outside the mall. They can look like this too. And this realization, I think, informs his maturity. We see growth in him at the end of the story. My feet no longer feel the heat, and as we run down Mia Street to Bella and I, the clouds move away from the sun, and the world seems to change. The world, I think, is him. He seems to change. It's not really the world that is changing, but his perception of the world. He gains some experience of the world. He sees something that he's never seen before, this grey man, this alien, and this determines how he can interpret the world differently. So he matures in this space here. He grows up a bit. He gains some experience, and the world seems to shift because of that. So the world seems to shift for him, and he still resorts to the language of science fiction to determine that shift. He says it's like an alien shift, an alien ship. So he still uses the language of science fiction, and he still relies on that. So, and throughout the story, he does this. He does it at the end of the story, and they do it at the beginning of the story as well. They use the language of science fiction to determine what the world is like. And as I said at the beginning, what Nchanka seems to be interested in specifically is masculinity, and how masculinity is differently defined for these young black boys. So CK, we've identified that his father was absent because he worked on a mine in Johannesburg. And you may have noticed this as well in the story, that there is a pattern of absence within the story. Fathers are absent in various kinds of ways in the story. The protagonist, we don't get any knowledge about how his father comes to be absent. All we know about the protagonist is that he lives with his mother and grandmother, and that's about all. It's as if the father is his father, the protagonist's father, is absent to such an extreme that he isn't even mentioned. We don't know if he's died. We don't know if he has a job somewhere else, like CK's father, and therefore isn't mentioned because he's sort of out of sight, out of mind. We don't know if the mother doesn't know the father. We don't know if they've divorced at some point. The story could be anything, but we don't know anything about the father, and that is just how absent he is. He's absent to the point that he doesn't even have a story to explain his absence, unlike CK's father, who is absent because he worked in a mine. The other boys have interesting backstories to how their fathers came to be absent, or why their fathers are absent, particularly Thando. So we have this extract here, which also speaks to Thando's father's absence. So this is the extract here. One time, about 2 weeks after the bishop's return, it was me, Thando, and Thobela, and we were out on the driveway playing cars with the garden bricks. I don't remember what happened, but Thando opened his thumb against something and screamed. He said it was Thobela's fault, but he wasn't sure. Then he said it was my fault. Then Thando bled and said the both of us, Thobela and I, we'd collected sins. He wouldn't stop saying that again and again, and then he walked through his front door and disappeared. We'd collected sins. Not ever, he says now about his house. I asked him why. He doesn't look up. First, and maybe for 8 seconds, he stays quiet. Then, looking up with this clot of dead ants stuck to the blood on his thumbs, he squints up at me and says, "My mother's been possessed by demons." He laughs and says they came through the kitchen sink. Throughout the lecture, I've been saying that what the boys do is read the world through the lens of science fiction, because in the absence of their fathers, all they have to rely on is pop culture and what pop culture tells them about men and masculinity. As we see in this instance here, this is a variation on that. So when Thando's father comes home, what Thando does is use the language of religion to read the world. So we know that Thando's father was absent because that is implied in the very first sentence. One time, about 2 weeks after the bishop's return. So Thando's father, the bishop, has not been at home for quite a while. And when he comes back, Thando immediately starts using the language of his father, the person with whom he identifies, to read and understand the world and the people around him. And in this case here, there's some kind of altercation or misunderstanding that happens amongst the boys. And from that altercation, from that misunderstanding, from that argument, Thando becomes accusatory, he becomes flustered, he becomes angry, and he says they have collected sins. Thobela and the protagonist have collected sins. So I'm just going to read the first paragraph again. One time, about 2 weeks after the bishop's return, it was me, Thando, and Thobela, and we were out on the driveway playing cars with the garden bricks. I don't remember what happened, but Thando opened his thumb against something and screamed. He said it was Thobela's fault, but he wasn't sure. Then he said it was my fault. Then Thando bled and said that both of us, Thobela and I, we'd collected sins. He wouldn't stop saying that again and again, and then he walked through his front door and disappeared. We'd collected sins. So Tando inflicts pain upon himself, but he's not willing to um, admit that. He's not willing to admit that he has caused harm to himself. I suppose because it may bring shame to him. We're not really sure of the reason here. But whatever the reason is, whatever the taboo is surrounding hurting yourself amongst these boys, he immediately starts to blame other people around him. So the people closest to him take on the guilt and the shame that he feels from having done this to himself. So he cuts his thumb on something, probably on one of the garden bricks that they're playing cars with, and he begins accusing Tobela and the narrator of doing him harm. Of course, we know this not to be true because even Tando himself becomes confused and changes his story as he goes along. Finally, he says that Tobela and the protagonist have collected sins. So he tries to alleviate his guilt onto others by saying they are sinful, not him. Later on, sort of in the last quarter of the extract, the protagonist says first, and maybe for 8 seconds, he stays quiet, then looking up with this clot of dead ants stuck to the blood on his thumbs, he squints up at me and says, "My mother's been possessed by demons." He laughs and says they came through the kitchen sink. This is another instance here where Tando seems to be using the language of religion to explain a phenomenon or an occurrence that he doesn't understand, that he's never probably encountered before, that he's never had anyone explain to him. So he resorts to the language of religion by saying she is possessed by demons. In reality, what is probably the case is that she has some kind of mental affliction. The possessed by demons makes me think that she might have schizophrenia, that she might see or hear things that other people don't, probably. But all he has is the language of his father, religion, to understand what is happening. And so we see that because of his association with his father, because of his, as it suggested, his sort of admiration for his father, he uses his father's language, not necessarily the language of religion, but the language that his father has given to him, which is religion, to understand what is happening. So he says people have collected sins, and he says his mother has been possessed by demons. So we see the same pattern happening with the other boys, where they believe that men look like a specific kind of super or uber masculinity. Men are muscular, men are athletic, men are violent, and they use that kind of science fiction, pop culture language to inform the understanding of what's happening around them. And we see the same blueprint or pattern being expressed here in Tando, where he uses religion instead of science fiction because his father has now returned and his father has some kind of influence over him. What is interesting about the absent father argument is that what is missing from that argument is how the mothers in the story are actually present. So in the story, we have all this discussion about how fathers are absent and how the boys are sort of end up being somehow deficient because of that. They act out in strange ways. They steal panties off clotheslines. They steal things from shops that they're not supposed to. They have these weird ideas about how the world works around them. But throughout the story, there are these instances in which the women in their lives are providing more than adequate, are acting as more than adequate role models for them. It seems that simply because they are women, the boys don't identify with them as readily as they would men. So there are lots of passages throughout the story where you can see how women are positive influences on the boys, but the boys always seem to miss it or ignore it, or don't recognize it. The mother is constantly trying to tell him to do his homework and not play video games. The teacher is there disciplining them and keeping them in order. And also, quite significantly, the mother um, shows what kind of positive behavior looks like. So she's a nurse and she works and gets a promotion at her in her job, and they celebrate with cake one evening. So those are kinds of positive behaviors and positive um, kinds of modeling behaviors that the mother exhibits that the boy, the protagonist in this case, seems to miss. So there are these instances here where the women in their lives present, as I said, more than adequate role models for them, but they miss them because they are not men. And the men in their lives are fictitious, completely fictitious. And when they do encounter a man within the real world, they use the kinds of fictitious science fiction language to read those men. So they could have, if they were sort of attentive enough, if they were sort of mature enough, they could have recognized that there are these positive role models in their lives, but they seem to miss that constantly throughout the text. So just sort of keep that in mind when you are grappling with the text. There have been quite a few students in the past who have sort of written off the boys as sort of lacking in maturity, being sort of delinquent in some way, because of the theft and stealing panties. The students often call them perverts for some reason. I wouldn't go that extreme. I think these are boys, simply boys, who are not doing anything particularly violent, who are struggling to express themselves, and also they are boys. They're still sort of developing their moral compass. They're still sort of developing a sense of what is right and wrong in the world. If these were sort of 25-year-olds stealing panties off washing lines, I would say, maybe something's wrong with them. But they're 8 or 9. They seem to just be sort of experimenting with the world around them. I don't feel sort of comfortable judging boys who are developing themselves, developing sexualities, to simply call them perverts or delinquents in some ways. And students would often sort of judge them and be quite harsh on them because of the absent father motif that sort of runs throughout their lives. They would sort of blame the fathers for doing this. Also, I'm more sympathetic to the boys and the situation that they find themselves in. Having an absent father within the South African context is not at all unique. There are many instances of this throughout the country with children having parents who are single mothers or grandmothers. So what the text seems to suggest is, even in the absence of fathers, there are still people like the mothers, like the grandmothers, like the teachers, who are present within their lives, and can sort of anchor them and develop their sense of morality, and also teach them about sex and sexuality, how it is sort of the safeties and dangers around sex and sexuality. So I'm sort of more sympathetic to the situation than a few of my other students are. So I'll leave the lecture there. We'll stop there, and the next time I see you, we will talk about the essay questions. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day, or sleep, or whatever activity you're going to engage in, depending on what time of day you are listening to this. In my case, good night.